Welcome to a new session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest Books collection. In this session, we explore the French satire Candide, a book that may sound intellectual and boring, but is filled with the kind of slapstick satire we see in TV humor, on Saturday Night Live, for instance. Candide was written by the philosopher Voltaire, who was considered the father of the French Revolution. Voltaire used plays, essays, histories, and the satiric novel to poke fun and express outrage at the corruption and inhumanity of church and government in the 1700s. In this session, we'll review Voltaire's life and the adventures of Candide. But first, let's look at the Age of Enlightenment, the period when this book was written. The Age of Enlightenment followed the Renaissance and the Reformation of the Catholic Church. After the Reformation, a time when the power of the Church was questioned and somewhat reduced, there was a new age of deductive reasoning and scientific discovery, called the Age of Enlightenment. It took place during the 1700s, when leading philosophers embraced the idea that knowledge is attainable through reason, leading to the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." These philosophers viewed the newborn human soul as a blank slate, able to learn and improve. The idea that each person should be allowed to think for themselves was revolutionary, literally, and led to many revolutions, including one in the United States. Many philosophers of the time, some were called optimists, believed that humankind could use their reasoning to understand God's natural laws. Any suffering was an opportunity to better understand natural law, so every difficulty was an opportunity to learn and eventually be happy. Taken to a logical extreme, this implies that suffering is good because it's the outcome of God's natural law. It's this sarcastic distortion of optimism that Voltaire makes fun of in Candide. We'll use Candide's story to better explain optimism in the Age of Enlightenment, but first let's look at Voltaire's life. Voltaire was born in 1694 in Paris, the fifth child of middle-class parents. His given name was François-Marie Arouet. He received a classical education from the Jesuits, so knew firsthand the shortcomings of that powerful and intellectual group of Roman Catholic educators. Voltaire achieved notoriety by the age of 24, writing satire that delighted many but also offended the powerful. In 1717, Voltaire was sent to the Bastille, Paris's infamous jail, for the first time. He was suspected of authoring some libelous materials and spent almost a year in the Bastille, in a room that was later named for him. While there, he revised his tragic play, Oedipus. He also began an epic poem about Henry IV of France. These two early works are about freedom and justice, two principles that Voltaire championed. The theme of Oedipus, for example, is the tyranny of the priesthood. At 23, following his first imprisonment, he adopted the pen name Voltaire. He returned briefly to the Bastille in 1726 after a quarrel with a nobleman, again because of his satirical writing. Voltaire never hesitated from publishing the unprintable, and throughout life he had to flee from one enemy after another. When he left the Bastille the second time, it was under the condition that he go to England. He stayed there for 3 years. His stay in England was very important. Prior to that time, Voltaire was considered well-educated and witty, but not a profound philosopher. When he returned, it was as one of Europe's foremost thinkers. Voltaire learned to read and write English quite well in England, where he found greater freedom than in his native France. He wrote a book there called Philosophical Letters, which praised British government and literature. He came to know such authors as Jonathan Swift, who had just published Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travels bears a strong resemblance to Candide. Both are social statements that masquerade as adventure stories. This kind of book, where a hero travels far and wide and has many adventures, is also similar to Don Quixote, which is discussed in another session of the Instant Expert series. Voltaire's admiration for the English was reciprocated, but much as he enjoyed England, he yearned to go home. In 1729, he was allowed permission to return. However, when his book Philosophical Letters was published in 1734, after his return to Paris, it was burned because of the negative picture it painted of the French compared with the English. A warrant was issued for Voltaire's arrest, and he fled to a small independent province. He lived there with his mistress, Émilie, a noblewoman, and her understanding husband. Émilie was 12 years younger than Voltaire. She was a mathematician, scientist, and philosopher, and dedicated to optimistic philosophy. She also shared Voltaire's enthusiasm for physicist Sir Isaac Newton, and translated Newton's landmark work, the Principia, into French. Voltaire returned to Paris in 1744 and became a member of the royal court. This pattern of being very much in favor or very much out of favor is a theme of both Voltaire's life and that of his hero Candide. In 1750, Voltaire accepted another court appointment to Frederick the Great of Prussia. Voltaire took up residence at Frederick's court in the city of Potsdam, but his friendship with the monarch was not long-lived. Voltaire found Frederick arrogant and intellectually pretentious. He left, but not before publishing a harsh criticism of one of Frederick's cherished royal institutions, the Academy of Science. Voltaire was arrested while leaving the country, but soon released. Knowing he wouldn't be welcomed in France, where his treatment of Frederick the Great was seen as insulting, Voltaire moved to Switzerland. He was a wealthy man through inheritance and through his many literary works. He then wrote Candide, in 4 days, according to some sources. On the 4th day he came out of his room, where he'd worked non-stop, and gave the manuscript to his niece, saying, "Here, curious madam, is something you may read." Voltaire lived with his niece, Madame Denise, for many years. She was also his mistress. Candide was written in the fullness of Voltaire's maturity, when he was in his 60s. It was published under a pseudonym, perhaps because Voltaire knew that it would cause a tremendous outcry. He often published anonymously, but gladly took credit for Candide after religious leaders in Switzerland banned the book and had it burned. Voltaire died in Paris at the age of 84. He had returned to that city that exiled him so many times for the premiere of his last play. Although poor health kept him from opening night, he attended the 6th performance and was enthusiastically received by a loving audience. The French people cherished their witty and unbowed philosopher, whose most famous quote is, "I do not agree with the word that you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." On his deathbed, Voltaire refused the Catholic Church's last rites, provoking one last conflict with his old enemy, the Church. 13 years later, controversy regarding his right to a consecrated burial ended, and Voltaire was entombed in the Panthéon, the French equivalent of England's Westminster Abbey. Candide is set in the mid-1700s and tells the disastrous mishaps of Candide, the illegitimate son of a baron. Candide falls in love with someone outside his class and pursues her from the old world to the new world and back again. The characters in the book have names that often tell what the character is like, a common literary device in satire. There are many characters in the book, but the principal ones are Candide, a young man whose name means candid and innocent. Pangloss, his tutor and companion. One meaning of Pangloss was windbag. Cunegonde, Candide's beloved and the daughter of a baron. Although there were several medieval queens by the name of Cunegonde, the name was probably chosen because it has an unflattering sexual meaning in the slang of Voltaire's time. Cacambo, Candide's servant from the New World. Once again, there's a scatological meaning to the name, but Cacambo also sounds like the word cocoa, which suggested America to Europeans. This helps define the character as a native of the New World, while inferring his native sexual prowess. And Martin, an elderly pessimist. Now let's go through the story of Candide, starting with the book's opening. Voltaire writes, "In the castle of Baron Thunder Tentronckh in Westphalia, there once lived a youth endowed by nature with the gentlest of characters. He combined sound judgment with great simplicity of mind. It was for this reason, I believe, that he was given the name of Candide." In the opening sentence, we hear the first of the book's many superlatives when Candide is called the gentlest of characters. This sets up a tone of optimism. Everything is best in the world that Voltaire draws. We also see a reference to assumptions of the Age of Enlightenment when Candide is described as having sound judgment. That is to say, Candide has reasoning skills. And the reference to Candide's great simplicity of mind could point to another major premise of Enlightenment. The hero is like an innocent newborn, ready to learn the meaning of the world through deductive reasoning. Soon we meet the tutor Pangloss, called the greatest philosopher of the province, and Candide's uncle, a pompous baron who bears a striking similarity to Voltaire's enemy, Frederick the Great. The baron's son, who appears throughout the book, is another self-absorbed royal. Other characters in this first part include the baroness and her daughter, the beautiful Cunegonde. We soon learn Pangloss's philosophy. As the family tutor, he instructs Cunegonde and Candide, who is the illegitimate son of Cunegonde's aunt. Pangloss explains cause and effect in these words: "All things were made for a purpose. Noses were made to carry glasses, and so we have glasses. Legs were intended for pants, and so we wear pants. Here we see a typical use of irony by Voltaire, who takes a logical thought to a ridiculous extreme. Pangloss instructs Cunegonde and Candide to look for cause and effect in their homes, which he calls the best of all possible worlds. One day, as Cunegonde walks near the castle, she sees Pangloss in the bushes, giving a lesson in experimental physics to her mother's chambermaid. Here's how Cunegonde interprets her tutor's encounter with the chambermaid, to quote Voltaire. Since Lady Cunegonde was deeply interested in the sciences, she breathlessly observed the repeated experiments that were performed before her eyes. She clearly saw the doctor's sufficient reason and the operation of cause and effect. After seeing them together, Cunegonde decides to perform her own experiments with Candide. But her father, the Baron, discovers them together, and he throws Candide out of this best of all possible worlds. This is Cunegonde and Candide's reward for pursuing scientific methods of discovery. Now Candide's adventures begin. Cold and bereft, he wanders to a neighboring town where two uniformed men offer to buy him food and give him money simply because Candide is 5'5". Candide thinks this is a confirmation of Dr. Pangloss's optimistic teaching that all things happen for the best, because even though he lost his home, new friends have appeared to take care of him. One of the soldiers tells Candide, "You are now in the service of the most charming of kings. Your fortune is made and your glory is assured." With that, Candide is shackled and taken off to the army. There he goes through endless drills and is constantly beaten. When he runs away, he is captured and beaten again. Through the kind of coincidence that fills this book and gives it an unreal sense of comedy, the king of the Bulgarians appears during Candide's beating and pardons him so that Candide can live to join the Bulgarians in a bloody war against the Iberians. In this fictional war, the Bulgarians represent the Prussians and the Iberians represent the French. These names are made up, but the conflict represents the 7 Years' War in France. Candide, appalled by the bloodshed and brutality, runs away again. He sees village after village in ashes, burned in accordance with international law. He reaches Holland, where he expects to be treated in a Christian manner, but finds only hostility, until he makes friends with an Anabaptist. An Anabaptist is a person who has not been baptized, and baptism was almost mandatory during this time of tremendous church power. However, the Enlightenment philosophers disagreed with baptism because they said that there is no such thing as original sin. Voltaire uses an Anabaptist to show the kindness that no Christian is capable of. Candide next meets a beggar who is covered with sores and racked by a violent cough. With every cough, the beggar spits out a tooth. This kind of graphic burlesque humor occurs throughout the book, which is why it seems like TV parody. The pathetic beggar is Pangloss, who tells Candide that the Baron's home was destroyed by Bulgarian soldiers. The soldiers raped and murdered Cunegonde and killed the Baroness, the Baron, and their son. Candide is devastated. Then he asks why Pangloss is so diseased, and Pangloss says that his lover, the chambermaid Paquette, gave him a sexually transmitted disease that she contracted from a Franciscan monk. Pangloss proudly says that the infection is traceable back to Christopher Columbus's companions, who brought it from the New World. Candide, in one of his many innocent remarks, asks, "Wasn't the devil the root of this strange genealogy?" Pangloss assures Candide that all is for the best, because although disease is painful, contact with the New World has brought many rewards to Europe. For example, chocolate. The Anabaptist also employs Pangloss, and the three take a ship to Lisbon. Pangloss tells the Anabaptist that private misfortunes make up the general good, and the more misfortunes there are, the more all is well. At this point their ship is caught in a storm, and all on board are lost, except for Candide, Pangloss, and a heartless sailor whose life was saved by the Anabaptist, who died saving the sailor. These three proceed to Lisbon, but as soon as they reach the city, there's a terrific earthquake. This was an actual event. The Lisbon earthquake and fire took place on November 1st, 1755, and 30,000 people were killed. Voltaire wrote a controversial poem on the disaster, reprimanding those who profit from human misery. A section of the poem reads, "The heirs of the dead would now come into their fortunes. Masons would grow rich in rebuilding the city. Such is the natural effect of natural causes." Officials in Switzerland, shocked at Voltaire's questioning of fate and his cynicism about humanity, wrote to the famed philosopher Rousseau and asked Rousseau to refute Voltaire. Rousseau agreed and published an article in which he said that the earthquake was humanity's fault and not God's. Rousseau's reasoning was, had people not been living in cities, which were unnatural, they would have been spared the horrors of Lisbon. This footnote gives an idea of how active the philosophers of that time were. Their works were popular journalism and influenced the growing middle class, who had the most to benefit from revolutionary ideas such as personal freedom. To return to our story, the sailor loots Lisbon while Pangloss and Candide try to help earthquake survivors. At this point, members of the Inquisition decide to hold trials for individuals who are accused of questioning the Church. Pangloss and Candide are erroneously seized and tried, and Pangloss is hanged. Candide is flogged, absolved, and blessed when an old woman appears and leads Candide to his beloved Cunegonde. He is amazed that Cunegonde lived through the destruction of her home by the Bulgarians. Cunegonde tells Candide that although she was wounded, a Bulgarian captain found her attractive and kept her as his mistress, then sold her to an amorous Jewish merchant. Here we should note that although Voltaire opposed persecution of any kind, he often vilified the Jews, especially the ancient Hebrews whom he felt to be superstitious fanatics. Some consider Voltaire anti-Semitic, but considering how many religious and political groups that Voltaire satirized, it's difficult to say whether his characterization of Jews is any more personal than his characterization of the Jesuits. This Jewish merchant brought Cunegonde to his country house. One day at Mass, the Grand Inquisitor saw and took an interest in Cunegonde. When he discovered her noble rank, he reproached her for being in the possession of an Israelite and told the Jewish merchant to yield Cunegonde to him, as he, the Grand Inquisitor, was a high-ranking official. The Israelite refused. Finally, the two men agreed to share Cunegonde. The merchant was to have her on Monday and Wednesday, and the Grand Inquisitor on Sunday. Cunegonde was the Grand Inquisitor's guest at the Inquisition, where she saw Candide, and arranged for him to be brought to her. Voltaire says that Cunegonde had a very good seat at the Inquisition and enjoyed refreshments between Mass and the executions. At this moment the merchant bursts in on the lovers. He draws out a dagger and attacks Candide, who kills the merchant in self-defense. Then the Inquisitor arrives, and once again Candide is forced to kill. Cunegonde's companion, the old woman, plans their escape, and the three join a fleet of troops on their way to Paraguay, in South America. The troops are going to suppress a group of militant Jesuits who are inciting a South American tribe to rebel against Spain and Portugal. Candide hopes that the new world will be that best of all possible worlds, since the old world has not been kind to him. Once again Voltaire invokes history. The Jesuit revolt referred to occurred in 1756, and Candide was published in 1759. As Candide, Cunegonde, and the old woman travel, the old woman reveals that she is the daughter of Pope Urban X. Another footnote here on history and Voltaire's unrelenting attacks on the Church. Although Voltaire happily infers that popes had illegitimate offspring, here is a note to an 1829 edition of Candide, which Voltaire himself probably wrote. It says, "Note the author's extreme discretion. So far there has been no pope named Urban X. He, Voltaire, is afraid to ascribe a bastard daughter to a known pope. What delicacy of conscience!" The old woman's life history is devastating. While she and her mother were sailing, they were attacked by pirates and subjected to appalling indignities that Voltaire describes in lurid detail. They were taken as slaves to Morocco, where she was raped by a black pirate captain. Once again, Voltaire ascribes unpleasant attributes to a racial group, in this case Africans, but later in the story he presents a sympathetic picture of a black slave. The old woman says of her horrific experiences, "These things are so common they are not worth speaking about." The ship lands at Buenos Aires, where a proud and overbearing governor, Don Fernando de Bira y Figueroa y Mascarenes y Lampourdos y Sousa, falls in love with Cunegonde and asks her to marry him. His pretentious and humorous name is another comic device. Unfortunately, Candide must flee because he sought for the murder of the Grand Inquisitor. Candide goes with his resourceful valet, Cacambo, a man of mixed blood, to the Jesuits. There, a reverend father commander, a proud young man, welcomes them and questions Candide in German. He learns that Candide is from Westphalia and tells Candide that he is the brother of Cunegonde, and he also escaped the Bulgarian attack on his home. Candide, so pleased at this, says innocently, and to our ironic amusement, how happy Pangloss would have been had he not been hanged. The Baron tells Candide that a Jesuit discovered and rescued him, and as the Baron had been a very pretty boy, the Jesuit became fond of him and helped him to advance in the Jesuit order. After training in Rome, the Baron was now in the New World, where he was a colonel and a priest. The Baron frequently embraces Candide, but when Candide says that he plans to marry the Baron's sister, the Baron becomes enraged as Candide is not nobly born. He strikes Candide, who draws his own weapon and thrusts it to the hilt into the Baron. Candide is overwhelmed with grief that he, a kind and gentle person, has killed 3 men, 2 of them priests. Cacambo and Candide flee again. They encounter a group of natives called Oreillons, who are about to kill and cook and eat them until the Oreillons discover that Candide and Cacambo are not Jesuits. Then the natives treat Cacambo and Candide hospitably and take them to the border of their country. Although Candide had thought that the New World would be the best of all possible worlds, it isn't so far. After more hardships, Candide and Cacambo come to a country bordered by high mountains. On the road are beautiful carriages occupied by attractive men and women drawn by big red sheep. The children are dressed in gold brocade and play with pieces of gold, emeralds, and rubies. Candide and Cacambo are treated kindly in this land, which is called El Dorado. Candide knows that they found the one country where all is best. He also realizes that, despite what Pangloss said, things were pretty bad in Westphalia. Candide explores El Dorado and finds that it was an ancient Inca kingdom, but many Incas left it to conquer another part of the world and were themselves destroyed by Spaniards. A wise Inca prince stayed in El Dorado and, through popular consent, ruled that no one else should leave. This is how the people's innocence and happiness were preserved. Cacambo and Candide discover that Sir Walter Raleigh tried unsuccessfully to reach El Dorado 100 years before. Only its natural barriers protected El Dorado from European invasion. The El Doradans worship God, but they don't pray to him to ask for anything because they have all they need. They do, however, sing hymns of praise. All are priests. There is no religious power structure. The king of El Dorado is warm and intelligent, and he tells them that courts and prisons aren't needed in this peaceful land. Candide also admires the El Doradans' advances in mathematics and physics. But after a month, Candide longs for Cunegonde and suggests that he and Cacambo, using some of the jewels that lie around El Dorado like so many pebbles, return to the outside world. He is sure that wealth will empower them. The king helps them, but warns that they already have all they need. Why are they restless for something else? The El Doradans, he says, have learned to cultivate their gardens and live in comfort and safety. Candide and Cacambo, with gifts of jewel-laden sheep, encounter many difficulties on the trip back. They are cheated by every person whose help they need. At one point they encounter a black slave who has been maimed by his master. The slave says that every Sunday the Dutch Christians tell him that white and black are all the children of Adam. The slave says no one could treat his relatives more horribly. Candide sends Cacambo to Buenos Aires to ransom Cunegonde while he goes on to Venice, where they are all to meet. Candide is cheated of his remaining sheep, but finally makes his way toward France in the company of an elderly scholar, Martin. Candide still insists there must be some good in the world, but Martin says he's never seen it. Candide suffers more deceptions and loss as he and Martin travel toward Venice. On their way, they're detoured through England, where they witness an admiral being executed before an enthusiastic crowd. This was an actual event in 1747, when an English admiral was court-martialed and found guilty of losing a battle to the French. Voltaire had tried unsuccessfully to save the officer's life. In Venice, Candide finds Paquette, the Baroness's chambermaid who infected Pangloss with a sexual disease. She is now a prostitute, keeping company with an unhappy monk. He is also reunited with Cacambo, who is now a slave. Candide buys Cacambo's freedom. Cacambo says that Cunegonde is a maid in a household far away. He, Candide, and Martin travel by ship to free Cunegonde. In another absurd coincidence, 2 of the galley slaves on board turn out to be Pangloss and Cunegonde's brother, the Baron. Candide asks Pangloss how he survived hanging in the Inquisition, and Pangloss says that although the Holy Inquisition's executor of high operations did burn people marvelously, he was a rank amateur at hanging. The 5 then ransom Cunegonde, who has lost her beauty. The old woman, who is still Cunegonde's companion, suggests that the group buy a farm and live together. Candide feels that it's his duty to marry Cunegonde, but her brother still can't bear for Cunegonde to marry a commoner and threatens Candide. The group gladly sends the Baron back to Rome in the galleys, and all enjoy punishing a Jesuit who is also a German Baron. After their marriage, Cunegonde becomes uglier and more difficult. The old woman is even harder to live with, and Cacambo is overworked and unhappy. Pangloss longs for a university position, and Martin grows more pessimistic. The group philosophizes and argues about their fate, and one day the old woman summarizes their adventures and asks a question. Is it worse to be raped 1,000 times by Negro pirates, run the gauntlet of the Bulgarians, be flogged and hanged in the Inquisition, row in the galleys, in short, to undergo all the miseries they experienced, or to stay where they are and do nothing? No one has the answer, although Pangloss still insists that everything must be wonderful, although that hasn't been his experience. Finally, they go to a famous spiritual teacher, a dervish, for answers. In this famous passage, we hear Voltaire's view of God. Pangloss was the spokesman and said to him, "Master, we have come to ask you to tell us why such a strange animal as man was ever created." "Why are you meddling in?" said the dervish. "Is that your business?" "But, Reverend Father," said Candide, "there is a horrible amount of evil on earth." "What does it matter," said the dervish, "whether there is evil or good? When His Highness sends a ship to Egypt, is he bothered about whether the mice in the ship are comfortable or not?" "Then what should we do?" said Pangloss. "Hold your tongue," said the dervish. As we near the end of the book, Martin says to Candide, "Let us work without reason. It is the only way to make life bearable." But Pangloss, still the optimist, says, "All events are linked up in this best of all possible worlds. For if you had not been expelled from the noble castle by hard kicks on your backside for love of Mademoiselle Cunegonde, if you had not been clapped into the Inquisition, if you had not wandered about America on foot, if you had not stuck your sword in the Baron, if you had not lost all your sheep from the land of El Dorado, you would not be eating candied citrons and pistachios here." Candide, who has lost the optimism that carried him through 1,000 indignities, replies, "That's well said, but we must cultivate our garden." Here the book ends. Is Candide now a pessimist who wants to tend his garden and not try to improve his lot? That's very different from the belief reflected in the United States Declaration of Independence, written less than 20 years later, that one aim of life is the pursuit of happiness. What did Voltaire believe, and how have Candide's readers through the centuries reacted to his cynical masterpiece? Voltaire knew that Candide would shock many readers, as it still can, but the book was a huge success. 43 editions of it appeared between 1759 and 1789, and at least part of its popularity must be due to Voltaire's writing style. The book rushes furiously forward, event after event, only slowing down to make a social statement. As you've heard, there's nothing pretentious about the writing. Sentences are short, straightforward, and funny. We laugh uneasily at Voltaire's exaggeration and understatement. For example, when Pangloss keeps insisting that all is for the best, as he recovers from syphilis, is hanged by religious fanatics, and becomes a galley slave. Consider that we're reading a translation, and you can imagine how well written the original is. In Candide, Voltaire holds authority figures, philosophies, and human cruelty up to ridicule. We know what he disliked, but what did he believe in? First, Voltaire believed in a God who was removed from everyday life, a God who set up natural law, then left humanity to fend for itself. He felt that religion was only an accident of birth, the result of a person's cultural heritage. Second, Voltaire believed in rule by reason and fairness, but didn't trust the common people. He supported the idea of a benevolent dictator. Another thing that Voltaire believed in was education, because he felt that much of the unhappiness in the human condition was due to learned behavior that could be unlearned. Finally, we need to remember that Voltaire spent most of his life as a literary and social critic. That was his work. That lends itself to constant fault-finding and pessimism. Voltaire offers us no remedy for the misery of the world, no utopia, other than a glimpse of paradise in the unreachable land of El Dorado. We're not personally inspired by Candide. Our hero never triumphs over injustice, nor do we see hope for his future. But satire can inspire social change, even if it doesn't inspire us as individuals, because strong, humorous satire draws attention to problems and provokes a response. Though we may be amused by Voltaire's masterpiece, we don't feel better after reading it. He makes it clear that this is not the best of all possible worlds. At least, not yet.
This is the end of the session.